Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. My guest this week on the Godcast is Reverend Angela Tilby. Angela is a broadcaster, an author, and a priest in the Church of England. And Angela's been a previous guest, but we're going to be talking about her new book, which is entitled Good Faith: Why England Still Needs Its Church. So I do hope you enjoy this interview now with Angela. If you do, then please do subscribe to the YouTube channel or share the post with a friend or somebody in the church. But for now, enjoy this interview with myself and Angela Tilby. Well, I'm delighted to say that on the Godcast this week is a repeat visitor. I nearly said offender, but that would be very rude. Angela Tilby is joining me for a second time on the Godcast. So you can, if you enjoy this one, which I'm sure you will, you can go back and check the one out. But Angela is a broadcaster, she's a priest, and she's an author. So Angela, it's really lovely to be reacquainted. How are you?
Thank you, Alex. I'm fine. It's very flattering to me to be asked on again, second time, second bite of the cherry.
Yes, but we're here with a more specific agenda item, really, and that is to talk about your latest publication, which is it's out now, isn't it, Angela?
Yes, it
It's
is. It's
out.
called Good Faith, and it's a book that I've been writing for, I can't think quite how long. It must be a good 3.5 to 4 years, I think, if not longer. It's taken a long time to do, and it's been sort of the fruit of a lot of reflection as well as experience. And of course, it's been an extraordinary time. It's about the Church of England. It's about the history of the Church of England, about what I think we could forget that's important about it, and also because it's been quite an interesting period in the life of the Church of England the last 5 to 10 years, and what's built up to that and what its prospects might be now. I'd finished it before Sarah Mullally was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, but I sort of had in mind that something like this might happen, i.e., with the first woman Archbishop. So I was sort of hedging my bets a bit towards the end of the book, and very delighted when it worked out the way it did.
Yeah, so let's give the book its full title. It's a Good Faith: Why England Still Needs Its Church. Is
That's
that
the
got that
one.
right?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. So just you said talked about history a little bit there, Angela. Has there been times down the centuries where we've asked this question before? If the church still if England still needs its church, and
Uh,
when what did you discover?
Well, I suppose it was one of the things that strikes me, and it struck me as I was sort of thinking about the book, was how much of the story of the English church is a matter of contingency. It might not have happened this way. If Catherine of Aragon had born Henry VIII, a healthy, healthy son, would the Reformation have happened at all? Would we still be Roman Catholic? And if it had happened, what form would it have taken? I mean, when you're writing about something that's sort of so intimately connected as English nationhood, if one can put it that way, and the Church of England, they are very interlocked and interwedded. I think people today don't always realize that, which is one reason I wanted to write the book, because they've seen Church of England as something that's sort of, well, it's there, but it might not be there, and we could just get rid of it. But actually, an awful lot would disappear that we take for granted now if the church was, say, disestablished. It'd be very difficult to sustain the monarchy, for example. And people might think that's a good thing, that we should be a republic and all sorts of things. But there is a very close connection. And I think to understand where we are, even if you want to change things, you've got to understand why that connection is the way it is. So it was partly a sort of attempt for myself to review this and to try to make sense of what the issues facing church and nation are today, but also to try and spread that because I'm very aware there are people coming move towards some form of Christian faith at the moment. There's quite a lot of evidence that there is a reinterest from all sorts of different bits of society in the Christian faith. But I think that's never happened sort of out of context, and to have some grip or way of passing on what the history has actually been. I mean, it can't be exhaustive, of course, but just to point out some of the sort of key points, I think has been really quite important for me, and I hope it's interesting for other people, because we are a Reformation church, and yet the roots, we've never denied that we are part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That's the Church of England claim, which some would deny, but we presumably don't. And there are certain characteristics of the Church of England which I think are important and from now and then come under threat or challenge. And it's partly sort of recognizing what's in those threats and challenges and how they might be countered, I think, which was another reason to write it. So it'll serve as a sort of introduction to the C of E for people who want to explore that,
Yeah.
and perhaps a defense of the C of E for those who want to defend it or wonder whether it can be defended.
I think it really hit home to me, Angela, about the church and the connection to the state was at the Queen's death when
Yes,
you where there was all the pomp and ceremony and then obviously the subsequent coronation of King Charles. And I often when I'm walking the dogs or daydreaming wonder, you know, what the state would look like without the established church. To me it's almost unthinkable. Is it almost impossible to establish something like that in a country like England?
what impossible to
To
imagine
establish the church,
to
you know, it,
disestablish a
yeah,
church. I think it'd be more complicated than people assume,
yeah,
because it is so embedded in the state and in the state's understanding of itself. And I think that the King Charles III and Queen Elizabeth II, they were very conscious of and aware of the fact that the Church of England exists for people outside itself as much as for those inside. And I think that's very critical, actually. The Queen made a great deal of the fact that part of the role of the Church of England was to defend those of other faiths and the freedom of those of other faiths. Now, there would have been probably a time in the 16th century, for example, when that would have been a very strange point of view. But she was, of course, very well aware of the fact that in reality, that is the case, that sometimes the Church of England protects people of other convictions from what could be a kind of quite unsympathetic secularism, which makes no room at all for religion in the public sphere. There's a significance about having bishops in the House of Lords, part of our legislators, that they stand not only for the interests of the C of E itself, but for the C of E's investment in the nation. And that means people of other faiths and none as well. And I think if once you recognise that that's quite a subtle position to be in, we're very different from, say, France, which is much more secular in many ways. And it's whether we want to hang on to that or not, it's important to understand how deep it goes, I think.
yeah. And what about kind of relevance of the church, Angela? I sometimes think that those of us who are in it think we are more important to those out of it than we actually are. I don't know what you think. That we take ourselves seriously and we think we've got a role to play in society, which I strongly feel. But uh, quite often I visit secular schools, it's acutely aware to me that a lot of young people, for example, have just got no experience of church. They wouldn't even be able to tell you anything about it. They probably wouldn't even be able to name the Archbishop of Canterbury or the
Yeah.
one before, or anybody in it. What would your thoughts be?
Well, I've been involved in the life of three cathedrals, and in parish life. But one thing I've always noticed about cathedrals is how attractive they are as places for schools to visit, and how often they put quite a lot of energy into making relationships with schools, quite apart from church schools themselves, which of course have that sort of built into their DNA. And I agree with you that it isn't always obvious, but those churches and cathedrals, they are there on the landscape. And if you're educating people in a particular context, part of what you would draw them into understanding is why those buildings are there, at the very least. They are a striking part of our landscape in town and country. And I've noticed, well, really over religious education over the last 50 years or so, has been keen to draw children into the sort of facts on the ground. So to sort of ensure that they at least have some experience of being inside a church, and of course a mosque and a Sikh Gurdwara and other such places of worship. And it's taken pretty much for granted now that these places are open and available for children and for school visits and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But there's another way in which I think the church is very embodied still. You know, prisons, chaplaincies, the armed services, hospitals, the various chaplaincies that the Church of England operates in collaboration with others. Is important, I think. It suggests that the state understands there is a care of pastoral, a duty of pastoral care towards people, particularly at times in their life when they're vulnerable, and makes provision for that to be so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I spent some time in a prison last year, at my own choice, I must say, and spent quite a long time talking to prisoners and really saw the value of chaplaincy. But
Yeah,
just in the school context, it saddens me really, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but when you go into a secular place and you do religion, or in my case, the Church of England, as well as you can, I find there's a real intrigue and interest, particularly from the children. They want to know, and it's usually there's normally a cycle of pilgrimage talk, uh,
yeah,
why the Bible is important talk, those kind of things. And it's wonderful to see the young people's engagement and their eyes light up and ask really good, rich, challenging questions. But the minute you walk out the door, you think, well, I've just done their probably their one and only RE lesson
yeah,
this
yeah.
term, which is a real sadness, isn't it?
Yes, yes, I think it is. I mean, there's some advantage in a way about the fact that there's sort of slight sniffiness among people of I suppose the boomers onwards about organized religion. You know that this isn't something that we want to encourage particularly in schools. But of course, schools have to produce their own ethos, don't they? And very often the sort of little mottos and statement of values that schools come up with, they're they're very generalized, but they do stress neighborliness and good citizenship and values of compassion and care. I mean, it would be foolish to not recognize that these are derived from a Christian ethos
Yeah.
and they still have their roots in a Christian ethos. And just how much of our law, our sort of common sense behavior assumptions do go back to that ethos that we once all shared, whether it was through the Church of England or through the other denominations. So I wouldn't want to discount that. And I think in very recent years, this is coming to be more and more recognized as the alternatives appear. You know, we could live in a theocracy. We don't. Well, that's probably a good thing for most of us. We could live in a place where the practice of religion was more or less abolished or very strictly curtailed or limited, and we don't. And I think these are all things to be grateful for. We could also live in a place where, in a way, that there's a much more competitive sense between different denominations of faith. And I don't, on the whole, think that's true in the UK. And it's partly because over the centuries in which the Church of England has struggled to understand what it is, because so much of it came about, as it were, by historical accident. It's had to develop a way of dealing with difference, with conflict, with intolerance within itself as much as anywhere else. And I think it's done that job really quite well on the whole. Every now and then you get a sort of surge of very intolerant sectarianism in all churches, but on the whole it sort of beds down and quietens down after a bit.
Yeah, and this kind of question, does this, is this church still required? Well, our kind of festivals would certainly suggest that they are, wouldn't we? I mean, many churches report an uplift in numbers at Easter and at Christmas, so there is a yearning there. I wonder if you think that is about something more than just kind of tradition, or whether there's something else going on in society where people are yearning for something, and sometimes I think this is our one and only chance, this is our one and opportunity to try and bring them in, or just light a fuse or that ignite something in them. What do you think is going on there, Angela?
Yes, I was surprised this year in particular by how many people came to Easter services. This is a cathedral and we've got very good music and all of that, which is an advantage. But it was striking the numbers. I mean, it really felt quite almost overfull at times. And I think that's true. And I think people are drawn when they feel that they're going to be somehow uplifted. There's this sense of can we can we find something which speaks of dimensions of life which are not in the everyday. I think that's why some of those attempts that you and I will remember to sort of, in a way, secularize religious language to make it much more about ordinary everyday life, in a way, were doomed for failure because what people in the end want is to get a sense of a bigger perspective. And I think that's true at the moment. I mean, there are a lot of anxieties about the state of the world at the moment for all sorts of good reasons. Living as I do in Portsmouth, we're a big naval base, you're very aware of the pressures in a way on our oceans and seas, both the ecological ones and the threats from say Russia and Iran and elsewhere. We there is a feeling that the world is in quite an unstable place. And I think for young people in particular, that's quite alarming. And the feeling that can the church offer us some security, some faith, some confidence that the future may not be bleak, or that there are things we can do to protect ourselves against damage that we do to ourselves and to one another. And I think that's all really quite important. And it's also noticeable to me how much of this is conducted in a longing for tradition as well. Sense that actually, not that we want to replicate the past, but that the past may have something to give us that we can connect into. And I think that's a relatively new sense among people and younger people in particular.
Yeah, you've evoked a few thoughts in my mind, Angela. One is that I came from a place that went to the bishop's advisory panel and effectively got said turned away because I was critical of traditional worship, and was subsequently sent on a placement to a traditional place of worship, and subsequently became a liberal Catholic, and referred to as Father Alex Frost. So
Yes.
there's a bit of an irony there, but
Yeah.
there is also the challenge, isn't there, that if the church is still needed in England, what kind of church is it that is required? Is it a church that is
Mm.
deeply seated in its traditions
Yeah.
and doctrines, and this has been a debate that's been raging in the
Mm.
church, and somebody who I think would be regarded as a liberal progressive. I wonder what your thoughts are about, that, you know, that if the church is in the news for anything, it is
Mm.
normally about matters of LLF, or for people who are listening to this who are from the Church of England, matters about same-sex relationships has been the hot potato of the last General
Yeah.
Synod of which I've been a part. So perhaps let's start with that one. Is how much has that been a really challenging and difficult or positive thing for the church?
I think one of the things you have to realize about the Church of England is that because um, it's driven by different theological traditions, there's always space to move around in it. And a lot of people do. A lot of people might come in for the first time through a form of evangelical Protestantism, which is quite someway hostile to the mainstream almost, which sees itself as pure in some way that sort of echoes the Puritans of old, and I think is inherited from the Puritan tradition. So it's quite iconoclastic, it doesn't like images, doesn't like liberal thought particularly, and might indeed, in a quite different way, look for the secularization of worship in terms of worship style, that it needs to be contemporary music style rather than anything that's more traditional. And the trajectory that I've seen over many years now, and it's partly my own, I suppose, is that people may start there because they think this is very trendy and new and contemporary and alive and all the rest of it. But it gets quite boring after a time because sustaining the energy that goes with that is actually quite difficult, and they find themselves drifting into churches that are more spacious, less intense, that anyway have a deeper sense of liturgical tradition, and to their surprise, they find themselves feeling relaxed for the first time about faith and about God, and in a space where they can grow. What I don't see happening is it going the other way round. I don't often see people coming from a kind of, conventional liberal C of E background, going into a more extreme version of it. It seems that the process is always towards something that's a little bit more expansive, a little bit more generous and liberal in its capacity to embrace difference. Now, this is where you started. You started with LLF and all. To be honest, Alex, I may be quite wrong about this, but I think that embarking on the whole LLF process was one of the most disastrous things the Church of England has ever done. It was a complete waste of time and energy. The Church would have drifted its way towards a greater acceptance and understanding of same-sex relationships without this massive debate. And yes, some people would have been marginalized and critical of that, but drawing attention to it in the very kind of obvious way that happened with the Living in Love and Faith process, I think has just wound people up on both sides, actually, in ways that have been incredibly unhelpful and hurtful all ways round. I don't want to live in a church which all thinks the same about everything. I really don't. I want to have some, in my case, conservative evangelicals who I can have a good spat with. What's the point? You want some theological energy, don't you? Go.
Yeah, I was just kind of saying, as a member of the General Synod, I didn't engage with LLF in terms of the actual discussions and consultations, but obviously I engaged in the debates, I always felt we were just going down a rabbit hole, and there were only going to be losers and no kind of progress and winners. So I think it has been deeply damaging. Andrew, I'd like to ask you about something that I'm really passionate about, which is working class vocations and working class people within the church. Again, when you raise the subject, why the state needs the church, and if it does it need to change its kind of approach to working class vocations? I was surprised when I raised my private members motion how many people actually got in touch with me who were affected by it. I thought for many years it was just me with a chip on my shoulder, but actually to discover there are hundreds and hundreds of people that have been affected or hurt by this area of ministry and the church, that there's still work to do. I'd just be interested in your views.
It's a very long issue, this, isn't it? I mean, I can remember in the far off days of the Southwark ordination course and some of those ministerial courses that were set up as an alternative to the residential colleges. There was a very conscious determination to draw in people into ministry who had a vocation from all aspects of society, it was very much seemed to be on the agenda. But then you think, well, how do you train people and what do they need in order to function effectively? And I'm not sure that we've ever quite resolved that, that the technical name, in a way, for vicar or priest or minister, a clerk in holy orders. A clerk in holy orders. A clerk is a clerk. Clerk is someone who can read and write. Clerk is somebody who sort of, in a way, has that capacity to communicate and to organize people's way of thinking and responding to issues. Now, are those middle class characteristics, working class characteristics? Do they belong to any class? Does everybody have them in the same, I mean, there are many arguments about what constitutes class. Actually, there was the rather brilliant, who wrote this, a very famous book about the fact that, when there was less formal education for people who we might now call working class, you got a better quality of plumber because all these very bright people who were not going to public schools or were working in the trades and not in the professions. And so therefore the quality of work being done at that level was higher than it would be when you've excluded people and take them off into, as it were, middle class education. I think this is it can get very emotive and surprisingly sort of highly controversial. I mean, what do you want from a person who is a minister? What are their skills to be? And how do you draw on raw talent and, help that to be brought forward? I mean, I think much of it, I'm sure you'd agree with this, actually happens in the process of ministry, of doing it. You learn from your congregations, don't you? And I mean, I was in theological education for years, and I sort of saw people on courses and in residential training acquire the skills, or hope to acquire the skills that would enable them to minister. But I was always aware that it didn't really begin until they were actually stuck into their first job. We could prepare the ground a little bit, give people some tools to work with, particularly, I think, in terms of just self-knowledge and self-awareness and recognizing who they are in relationship to other people is really important in ministry. As for the sort of theological tools of the trade, I mean, there are some who are going to be better at that than others, and there's no reason why somebody who's sort of highly educated in a conventional way should be that much better at it than anybody else. So I think there's a lot of nuance to be attached to this. But I stick with the idea that somewhere in the Church of England, the clerk in holy orders, a person who is capable of that interpretative work, is what you're looking for. And how you get that and where it comes from and how you nurture it, that seems to me to be something that there's ongoing work to be done. I mean,
Yeah.
did you feel, Alex, when you were sort of looking at this, did you feel that you obviously did feel that class was a real issue? Did people suggest to you that you were not educated enough or that your background wasn't sufficient?
Certainly through the initial progress, yes.
Yeah,
Because I left school at 15 and went straight into education,
yeah,
and entering the process, it was very clear to me that to be ordained, I'd have to acquire a degree, and I do have a degree, and I'm quite proud that I've got a degree from somebody who left school at 15. But
yeah,
actually, that period of learning, has it served me in my ministry? Not really, if I'm being honest. It's been the boots on the ground, getting to know the landscape, getting to know the people that has been real formative for me. And I I just, I think it's wonderful that some people love academia. I think it's highly important as part of theology, but I also think that we've got lots of those,
yeah, yeah.
and maybe there's room for, and I'm not gonna put myself down by saying I'm not academic. I've got a degree,
Mm,
uh, but I think that that a lived experience, that in my case came from 20 years outside of academia, even longer, has served me well to do what I do today, and I think it's a balancing exercise. Often I've been challenged. People have said to me, "Well, what's working class?" And I don't think it really needs a definition. I think it's like, where are you from? What did you do? And how you can. I do sometimes worry, if I'm being really honest, Angela, that if somebody grew up in Leafy Lane, Oxfordshire or Cambridgeshire, and went to a lovely village school, and
mm,
then went and got a master's degree in theology, that is wonderful.
mm,
But
mm,
plonk them in urban estate Burnley,
mm, mm.
that is a challenge.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with that. I remember many years ago when I worked for the BBC making a film really about it was the time of that big report that Eric James was involved in came out, Faith in the City.
Mm,
And I remember going to a parish in Middlesbrough and felt terribly sorry for the parish priest who was doing everything he possibly could, including, steeling himself to go down to the working men's club on a Friday night, that you could see his discomfort. He was a middle class boy, sort of reasonably well educated, but just didn't know how to speak.
mm,
He couldn't find the language.
yeah.
I mean, it's true the other way around. Remember one of the things that we used to do when I was at Westcott House, one of the Church of England's training colleges in Cambridge. We used to, when it was the right sort of person, actually suggest to them that they did a summer placement in a place that was very, very different from what they were used to. And this meant, I can remember sending one person from Barrow-in-Furness, I think it was, to Leafy Kensington, and that that was really interesting. She came back, I mean, I think she was actually rather a success, and it was rather a triumph. But it could work the other way around as well, and people could feel both. I mean, you don't want to knock people's confidence either way round on this, so it has to be done quite delicately, but just to give some experience of being outside the comfort zone, I think is important for clergy, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. Angela, I'm mindful of time because we whizzed through this, and I know people who listen like 30 minutes. Well, we're at 30 minutes, so I've got to squeeze in a few more questions. One something I want to ask you about, that from a Church of England perspective is around mission. One of the frustrations I have is I think we're very good at talking to ourselves and saying, for example, poverty's wrong, poverty's wrong.
Yeah.
I really want us to break out from for example, rather than celebrating a food bank, actually, um, and forgive me when I say this, criticizing the food bank, not the people who run the food bank and who bring the food, but why the food bank is required, why it's there, and what role the church can play in its mission to actually reduce the number of feed banks, to call out matters of social injustice where these issues are arising, where we've seen, and people's well-being the subject of poverty is very close to my heart, and I'm not just talking about financial poverty. I'm talking about material poverty, numerous things, and I really think the church, personally, feel the church should be more progressive, more activated on these matters, and it doesn't seem to be so. I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
My perception is that most bishops and clergy of the Church of England are left liberals on the whole, and they would entirely agree with you. I mean, there's no question about there are issues of social injustice which it's right for the church to be heard on, to speak about. Um, I'm almost more worried about the other side, about what happens to those people who sort of claim a Christian inheritance, but actually associate it entirely with nationalism, with British or English identity, and in a way they don't get either a voice or an answer. Um,
Mm,
it was actually there was Bill Westwood, Bishop in the Church of England, Bishop of Peterborough, in the Thatcher era, who claimed he was the one Thatcherite bishop on the entire bench, and I think he was probably right. The church, in a way, has a good tradition of alliance with socialism and liberalism. Whether it's effective or not, whether it should be more effective, is another question. But what it doesn't seem to me to have much truck with, sadly, is the more Burkean, originally Whig but then a conservative view of what actually holds society together. And that could be in terms of mutual respect. It could be in terms of support for marriage, could be in support for certain understandings of children and growth, all sorts of things that don't come high on the Church of
mm,
England's agenda. I was I was trying to write something about this morning about, there's been this stuff in the news about women who were forced to give up babies who were born out of wedlock, and how they were, you know, really badly treated often in
mm,
mother and baby homes, and having to give up children in that sort of really quite ruthless way, and very painful for them.
mm.
And I was thinking, we that's that seems to be um, that's not that's not an issue in a way for today. But where is the voice of the church in supporting those things which hold society together rather than breaking them apart?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure. I've been a long term both fascinated by and critical of that movement that we call liberation theology. I am a victim, therefore I am deprived, therefore it is my duty to win back what has been taken away from me. whatever form it takes, because although I can see the linkage between liberation, the Exodus, the teaching of Jesus, all sorts of things, that there's an agenda there to be done. But the question to me is, how do you do it without causing more injustice?
Mm.
And without breaking those bonds without which no society can actually function. Um, and I don't really think it's the Church of England's job to live in endless conflict. You need rich people, you need successful people desperately, and it's one of the problems of the COV at the moment is that rich and successful people, as far as I can see, are drawn into those bits of the church which support their agenda, but they're not out there helping the rest of us. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of that. I mean, Holy Trinity Brompton, one of the successful mission agencies in the COV, very much respected and liked by celebrity culture, by financiers,
Mm.
highly influential. But it's miles apart from the COV on the ground, COV that you and I
Yeah.
know in
Yeah.
primary schools and in
Yeah.
food banks and in places where
Mm.
people actually live and happen. And it's how the church draws those things together, I think, is really critical at the moment.
Yeah.
And it,
Really, really interesting, Angela. And your point about, certainly in places such as Burnley, acutely aware of the right-wing nationalistic
yeah,
agenda that drags in, tries to, bring the Christian identity into place. It's really quite fearful,
yeah.
and frightening. Angela, just one last question before I let you go. Just, we started the conversation talking about Sarah Mullally, and how significant you feel that is or will be in years to come.
Well, it's I think a person who's a first is always of significance. She'll always be looked back on as the first woman to hold this role. I think she has particular skills which the church needs, not least for an intelligent conversation with the state, somebody who
Mm.
has been a bit of a bureaucrat, who
Mm.
understands how institutions work. That's really, really important. I think she's somebody who's not going to she's not going to be sort of theologically or poetically thrilling. I shouldn't think, but there are ways she can deal with that if she wishes to. No, I think she will. She won't be with us for that long, 6 or 7 years. I think until she'd probably retire. But I think right now, at the moment, after the very sad circumstances in which Justin Welby had to resign, she's she's got a job to do what she's good at, which is actually, leveling the playing field, quietening people down, and making the thing work again. And I'm
Mm.
sure she's more than capable of doing that.
Mm. Well, Angela, thank you for your time. Just in terms of the book, just let people know how they can find it and where it's available. I'm sure it'll be everywhere, but if you'd like to just share that.
Yes, well, it's published by Hodder Faith, and it's available on the, I mean, dreadful word Amazon, but it is available on Amazon very easily, or at a local bookshop. Waterstones, I know in various places have got it, and local independent bookshops can get it easily enough. Just go into one and ask, and they'll find it for you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I hope it's proved to be a worthwhile exercise, publishing a book. I'm sure it has. I've had the joy of that myself, and I know how special it is. So, our very best wishes with that, and
Thank
thank you
you.
for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Oh, it's really nice to see you again. Thanks, Alex.